this evening's presentation is to restate our aim, and that is to encourage model makers in the building of unusual models. And having researched the subject of the early torpedoes and the boats that launched them, I have to say that we have here some extraordinary vessels, some almost bizarre, as is this example of a Thornycroft design of 1883. Note the twin tubes in the bow and the two reloads behind, in between the funnels. Now, this area of marine manufacturing was presented as part of a permanent exhibition on the top floor of the Science Museum in the West End of London at Kensington. As part of their extensive ship model display, the entire collection was removed some years ago to be replaced with another permanent exhibition, and that was the history of the mobile telephone. The collection, however, is housed in a store nearby, and I believe access is possible. Now, Paul and I will deliver this presentation in 4 parts. In the first, I will deal with the beginnings of the independent locomotive torpedo from 1866 until 1890. Then Paul will talk about the early torpedo boats from 1870 to about 1890, when we see the arrival of the larger torpedo boats capable of offshore work. I will then cover the improvement in torpedo design and performance from 1890 up until the end of World War I. And finally, Paul will cover the development of the torpedo boat up to that same time. Please note that we are concentrating here on torpedo boats and not on torpedo boat destroyers. Now, some may be surprised that we start our discussion on the origins and development of the destroyer by looking at the concept of underwater attack on a surface vessel. This idea had been considered for centuries, as in this confusing drawing of a Chinese naval mine. But the event that really highlighted the possibilities of this form of attack was the American Civil War, which started in 1861 and concluded in 1865. Now, this war introduced a new range of lethality on land, the Gatling gun, on the sea, the Minotaur and Merrimack, and under the sea, the Hunley submersible and its spar torpedo. Although a similar form of attack had been made nearly a century before against British shipping during the American War for Independence, as shown here in this attack using a device designed by the American David Bushnell. Possibly the earliest form of underwater attack was the use of the static torpedo. Now, torpedo being an expression borrowed from a particularly predatory fish, which attacked its prey with a powerful sting in its tail. The static torpedo was, of course, to become known as the mine. This device could be made mobile by giving it buoyancy and allowing it to drift onto its target, or by being tethered, hoping that an enemy vessel would collide with it, or by carrying it to a vessel and affixing it to the hull, or by attaching it to a spar, driving at the enemy. In the latter case, this was demonstrated by both sides in the American Civil War, both above the surface and below surface approach to the target. Both sides were also able to demonstrate that the crews manning the attacking vessel were nearly always killed outright due to their proximity to the blast, designed to sink their opponent. Now, perhaps the best known incident of this type of attack was the successful sinking of the USS Housatonic, a Union frigate, on station blockading Charleston Harbor by the Confederate submersible you've just seen, CSS Hunley. She also simultaneously successfully sank herself. It was thought her crew would have been killed by drowning, but when she was raised quite recently, it was discovered that they had died due to concussion caused by the blast from the explosion of a torpedo. This corresponding operation using a surface vessel, which of course would be visible to the crew of the target, could easily be repulsed by gunfire before it could close with its prey. Now, these forms of attack were eventually superseded by others, which sought to achieve success without putting the attacking crew in such danger. Probably the earliest of these was proposed by an Austrian marine artillery officer who devised, on paper only, a small self-propelled explosive boat guided from a position on the shore or on a mothership by wires connected to its rudder, thereby controlling its movement. Following the officer's death, the idea was taken on by a retired Austrian naval officer called De Lupis, who improved the drawings and built a model of the contraption. In 1864, he took his drawings and to the Austrian naval staff, who, although they rejected the idea, felt that it could have potential and that more work was needed. They therefore suggested he consult with an Englishman, a marine engineer of some considerable repute, currently working in Fiume at the top end of the Adriatic, and his name was Robert Whitehead. Now, given the scope and potential of the modern torpedo, we should remember that in 1864, when De Lupis approached Whitehead, the purpose of such a weapon was seen as being to threaten the close blockade, although very quickly it came to be used for different situations. Thus, it would be expected that any device would be used in a coastal or inshore setting, or possibly in an estuary or river mouth against a static or slow-moving target, and therefore in a comparatively calm sea state. It would not at this stage have been seen as a weapon suited to a fleet action in the open sea. Now, Robert Whitehead took on the De Lupis proposal of a small clockwork-powered boat steered by lines from the shore. But despite improving the components of the idea, he could not make it sufficiently reliable or accurate. In particular, the lines were always getting entangled and nullifying the efforts of the steersman to control the weapon. After a year, he abandoned it, but remained fascinated by this form of attack. This led him to consider an alternative approach to underwater attack by using a self-contained vessel, which, having been launched beneath the surface, remained under the surface, moving under its own power. And by 1866, he had completed a prototype and was in a position to demonstrate his device to the Austrian-Hungarian Navy. Now, this useful image shows at the bottom the De Lupis model of his clockwork boat. At the top is a Whitehead torpedo, very similar to the prototype, and in the middle is a later development of the same torpedo. Note the single propeller on the early model and the twin screws on the later version, together with the absence of fins, and we will return to this point in a moment. Now, in 1866, the result was not entirely successful, though the inspecting team, Austrian naval staff, recognized the potential of the weapon, but decided that improvements were required before they could adopt it for their navy. The problems Whitehead had concerned the ability of the torpedo to run consistently at a set depth and for it to maintain its launch direction. Now, a solution to the former was achieved by 1868. His prototype had used a hydrostatic valve to adjust the elevators at the tail of the vessel. However, it produced an erratic porpoise movement which needed dampening, and he achieved this by the use of a pendulum working on a fore and aft axis, acknowledging the torpedo's attitude and making compensation for the erratic performance of the hydrostatic valve. Now, if you consider this in a horizontal plane, when bringing a ship onto a new course, if midships is given as the vessel comes onto course, she will continue to swing beyond her desired course. If again midships is called when she reaches her set course, she will again continue to swing beyond her course, and so on and so on. The trick is to call midships slightly before you come onto course, and that is what the pendulum does in a vertical play. Now, directional stability was more difficult to control, and without that stability, the torpedo was very much a close quarter weapon. This probably was just as well, given that the performance of these early torpedoes was 6 to 7 knots with a range of about 220 yards. However, I should remind you of the purpose at this time. They were to be a threat to the close blockade in coastal and inshore waters. Now, following the more successful trials of 1868, other navies started to take an interest in this newfangled weapon. Thanks to the commander of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, Vice Admiral Lord Paget, the British naval staffs had been alerted to the existence of this weapon in 1868. In fact, they'd known about it since 1866, but had done nothing about it, thinking it to be a crackpot idea. However, it took until 1869 for a committee to be set up and a team sent to Fiume to inspect the weapon. Following this visit, Whitehead was invited to demonstrate his device at Sheerness in the mouth of the River Medway the following year, 1870. But note, it still had a single propeller, hence the need for fins. And you can even see a small bilge fin on the bilge keel on the side of the torpedo. The trial was a success, and in the following year, a contract was signed with Whitehead to build the weapon under license in the UK at the Royal Laboratories. And both parties agreed to collaborate over the development of the weapon. Now, this was to be a great benefit to Whitehead. For instance, one of the first improvements in the Royal Laboratory was the introduction of contra-rotating propellers. Now, this interesting picture is part of a larger one showing the torpedo being lifted out of the water by HMS Thunderer, probably in 1872. It shows the contra-rotating propellers operating on the same axis, as well as fins. So this trial may have been done to test out the twin screw system before abandoning the fins. In the original design, Whitehead had only used a single propeller, and in order to reduce the twisting effect this would have on the torpedo as it ran towards its target, he had fitted the large fins above and below the device. These helped to prevent the torpedo from rolling, and they were now to be no longer necessary due to the use of contra-rotating propellers. Their removal would have reduced drag, enabling an improvement of speed. Interestingly enough, this was discovered by a straightforward mechanic working at the Royal Laboratories, not by any designer, a chap who knew his tools and understood the problems, and up he came with it. He got no reward for it whatsoever. Following the Royal Navy's move, other navies quickly followed suit. France signed an agreement in 1872, followed by Italy and Germany in 1873, and Russia in 1876, with Turkey, her sworn enemy, following in 1878. By this time, Whitehead's works were exporting to 14 major navies. However, the United States of America decided not to follow suit and went down a slightly different line, and we will return to their experiments later. Whitehead's genius had introduced a weapon that was free-running and subsurface, and it was this arrangement that was to win through as the desired form of subsurface attack apart from the mine until the end of World War II. The enthusiasm for it was no doubt connected to the David and Goliath syndrome, in that it was now possible for a small vessel to sink the largest warship in the world. Other systems arrived simultaneously with Whitehead's invention, the towed and the wire-guided weapons. The former was invented by a Commander Harvey in the Royal Navy and his brother, also a naval officer. The towing ship used a method of towing the torpedo on a line parallel to the ship's course, but with a line lying at an angle of 135 degrees to that ship's course.
Using otterboards in much the same way as a minesweeper would deploy a paravane or a trawler a net.
This system was supported over Whitehead's independent locomotive torpedo by none other than Commander Fisher, later Admiral Fisher and Controller of the Navy, who was very dubious, for good seaman-like reasons, about the effect and accuracy of Whitehead's device. However, the towed arrangement soon enough proved to be unworkable, not the least because of the vulnerability of the towing vessel to defensive fire as it came within range of the target. And you can see here the two coming out either side. One is going to be wasted, I think, but no little vessel could hope to survive that. The wire-guided torpedo showed promise. It had a considerable range and a much larger warhead than the Whitehead, but at the same time, it was set up to be operated by the Army in the form of the Royal Engineers, from a shore base to be used in port and anchorage defence. These systems have no interest for us, as we are concerned with the above-surface launch of an independent torpedo from a fast, small vessel. Surprisingly, the spar torpedo was still being used up until the turn of the century and was actually more successful than the towed concept, which really was a complete failure. The torpedo you're looking at here is a Brennan torpedo and was controlled by electrical systems. Now, at this stage, I think it's worth looking at the specifications and performance of some of these early weapons. As has been said, Whitehead's prototype was a fin vessel with a single propeller giving a speed of 6 to 7 knots with a range of 220 yards. It measured 11 foot 7 inches overall with a diameter of 14 inches. It was made of wrought iron boilerplate and weighed 265 pounds, including its warhead of 18 pounds. Whitehead had thought long and hard about a suitable engine and settled on a design of his own, using compressed air at 370 pounds per square inch and 2 concentric cylinders, not at all that unlike a much later engine called the Vulcan. By 1868, with the same dimensions, the torpedo now displaced 346 pounds, including the warhead of 67 pounds, a maximum speed of 7 knots,
a range of 300 yards, but with a change of engine to a V-twin model, whilst the speed stayed the same.
The range increased to 600 yards. By 1876, when the Royal Navy commissioned its first purpose-built torpedo boat, the torpedo was still 14 inches in diameter, but had an LOA of 13 foot 3 inches.
A 3-cylinder compressed air engine designed and built by Peter Brotherhood, based at Lambeth in London. A weight of 554 pounds, including a charge of 58 pounds.
The speed with this engine was now 21 knots, far faster than the lumbering ironclad, but still with a comparatively short range of 600 yards. So not yet a weapon for a fleet action on the high seas. It is worth pointing out here that the factors promoting range and speed in these torpedoes were the power of the engine and the air pressure that could be contained in the air chamber to drive it. Whitehead had always intended that his torpedo would be launched underwater and was quite alarmed when he heard that certainly the British and the French were prepared to launch it from the weather decks of small craft. Now this shows a launch probably in the late 1880s. The first vessel to do this was Lightning, but not until 1879. She had been ordered by the Royal Navy in 1876 and equipped initially with a spar torpedo before being modified with a bow tube for launching her torpedoes. Note the reload torpedoes on their trolleys, either side above the funnel, And they also have trolleys and tracks taking them to the bow launching tube. She was built by Thornycroft on the Thames, a well-known constructor of fast pleasure craft. Some 6 years previously, this firm had built the first ever torpedo boat, the Rap, for the Norwegian Navy, again with the equipment for a spar torpedo. Although actually, in another account, I've heard that she was actually set up also for a towed arrangement. But she was later equipped with launch collars to permit an alongside subsurface launch. Now, this system was still in use during World War I. It did have the major disadvantage, though, that in attacking the attacking vessel had to slow down to a crawl to launch the weapon. This severely affected, in my view, the tactical use of the torpedo. The third method of launch was from the weather deck, was of course the swiveling tube, affording the possibility of a broadside attack. But there are problems with broadside attack, which I'll mention later in the second half. It was this method, however, that was to become the predominant one, except for those systems eventually employed for very fast vessels with planing hulls. But these do not form part of our narrative, either now or in the future. Now that we are beginning to drift into the realm of the torpedo boat, I would like to introduce Paul Fontenoy from New Mexico and editor of the Nautical Research Journal by posting an image of an American torpedo boat, probably in the 1880s. She's called the Morris, and I reckon she's named after a very well-known sailing revenue cutter. Paul will take over the talk about the early boats up to the point where we see the arrival of the larger first-class boats around 1890, by which time the Whitehead torpedo, now with an 18-inch diameter and a length of 16'7", could motor at speeds of 30 knots and carry a 198-pound warhead and had a range of 800 yards. Still too close for comfort. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you. As Ian mentioned, the principal weapon of early torpedo boats was the spar torpedo. Any successful attack with such a weapon relied on a stealthy approach, and the boat's development as a result emphasized stealth. Examples of this stealth approach were the Confederate submarines Hunley, which Ian has already mentioned, and some boats called the Davids. These could be trimmed down so that virtually the only thing that showed above the water would be the funnel and that tube towards the stern you can see there, which is actually an air intake. This requirement for stealth remained after the adoption of automobile torpedoes for two reasons: the short range of the torpedoes, which Ian's already mentioned, and the slow speed of the boats themselves relative to their potential targets. Even as the speed advantage of torpedo boats increased, the short range of their weapons still necessitated presenting a minimal target. And we have an illustration here of a pretty extreme version from Thornycroft, this Italian torpedo boat called the Avvoltoio. You can see even the funnels fall down to produce the target. Consequently, torpedo boats until the middle of the 1880s always tended to be small with very limited freeboard and minimal superstructure. The earliest torpedo boats designed to carry automobile torpedoes seem to have been the Danish Navy's torpedo boat number 1 and the Swedish Navy's Glimt, both delivered in 1874 and near sisters of the Norwegian Navy's Rap, which Ian mentioned, but fitted with dropping collars from the outset. There is some debate about the earliest torpedo boat to fit a launching tube. There's some arguments about some Spanish vessels, but actually the data doesn't support that. And the consensus seems to have settled on the Royal Navy's Lightning of 1876, which was not fitted with tube until 1879. All of these vessels were the products of Thornycroft. The search for speed had become a paramount design parameter for torpedo boats, both to allow them to pursue their targets and to enable them to close without being sunk. Developing high-speed small craft rapidly became a specialized business that very few builders managed successfully. Starting in the early 1870s, these specialist firms came to dominate the production of torpedo boats for the navies of the world. In Britain, the leading specialists were John I. Thornycroft and Company in Chiswick and Alfred Yarrow and Company in Poplar. Both had initially made their names for the production of fast steam launches for wealthy individuals and transferred their expertise to the construction of torpedo boats. Some early examples, such as Lightning, in which we saw a little earlier, differed very little in appearance from these steam launches, apart from the addition of torpedo launching apparatus. You'll notice in that Lightning image, it still has a cabin aft with paneling. A lesser producer was J. Samuel White of Cowes, which had developed quite a reputation for building very maneuverable steam launches armed with spar torpedoes, but was not as successful in transferring this expertise to torpedo boat construction. The dominant French firm in the field was Augustin Normand of Le Havre. Unlike other torpedo boat builders, Normand was a very long established family business founded to build fast sailing vessels in the late 1700s in Honfleur, which transferred to building fast steam vessels. Its principal competitor was the Société de Forges et Chantiers de la Méditerranée at La Seine, near Toulon. Two other French producers were Chantier Snyder in Chalon-sur-Saône and Chantier de la Loire of Saint-Nazaire, but both these firms almost exclusively built designs by the other two companies and only entered the field in the middle 1880s. The overwhelmingly dominant German firm was Schichau Werk in Elbing, which began as a manufacturer of marine steam engines and transitioned to building fast small craft. Its closest competitor, very much an also-ran, was AG Vulcan in Stettin, which built less than a quarter of the number of torpedo boats as Schichau. In addition to their dominant positions in their domestic markets, these four leading firms, Thornycroft, Yarrow, Normand, and Schichau, almost completely dominated the international market for torpedo boats in the period from to 1890, either by building boats themselves for export or by licensing their designs to shipyards in foreign countries for service in those yards' national fleets. There are two particularly striking examples illustrating this dominance. In 1878, Yarrow licensed a design very similar to Avvoltoio, but with the positions of the engines and boilers reversed and fixed funnels, you'll notice, to Russia, which proceeded to build 95 examples in 9 different yards within a year for service with the Baltic and Black Sea fleets. Even more astonishing was Schichau's 39-meter type. Exactly 200 boats were built to this design, either by Schichau or licensed yards between 1886 and 1894, of which only 9 were for the Imperial German Navy. The other boats served with Austria-Hungary, which are the two top left-hand ones. The one on the left is as originally built. The one on that next to it with 2 funnels is as reboilered. For the Chinese Navy, for Italy, again, there's the second row. The first one on the left is the original design. The one that's next to it, again with 2 funnels, is the type as reboilered. For Japan, there's 4 Norwegian boats, a Russian boat, a Swedish boat, which is actually a photograph taken in World War II when it was still in service as a convoy escort, and finally, a boat for Turkey. Each navy specified its own armament requirements. For example, the German boats carried a single bow tube and 2 rotating deck tubes, while the Austrian boats had 2 bow tubes and 1 deck tube. And most of the Russian examples only had 2 bow tubes. There were also 2 variations in these boats' power plants. Most had locomotive boilers and a single funnel, but later boats were fitted with water tube boilers and 2 funnels, and many Italian and Austrian boats, as you can see in these images, were reboilered too. I'm working on a study of warship exports in the period from 1865 to 1915. And to that end, I created a database of all warships built for export during this period. There were more than 2,000 vessels either exported or licensed, and almost 80% of them were torpedo boats. Something that makes building models of these early torpedo boats so interesting is that products of each of the major producer countries, Britain, France, and Germany, almost always conformed to a national style across their yards. British boats, like this one, usually had round semi-counter sterns, vertical hull sides, and essentially flat flush decks. Early boats usually had this bulbous bullnose bow. The bulbous bows made these boats too wet and were replaced by ram bows, not because of the suicide mission concept as we discussed a few minutes ago, but because the ram provided increased buoyancy forward to better support the weight of fixed bow torpedo tubes. From the mid-1880s, most British torpedo boat designs incorporated turtleback foredecks, a feature that would continue in British torpedo craft for over the next 20 years. French boats were completely different. By and large, they had plumb bows and either plumb or semi-counter sterns that were semicircular in platform. The most distinctive feature was the hull cross-section. You can see this in the row along the bottom here. Vertical sides blended into a heavily arched deck, essentially a turtleback from bow to stern. The curvature was so extreme that it often required fitting a light flying deck on top of the hull to allow the crew to function. German boats were equally distinctive, unlike British and French boats, which had quite long parallel mid-bodies and in plan form. They had long, very fine bows, fuller quarters with pointed canoe sterns, and no parallel mid-body. The deck cambers was much greater than in British boats, but rather less than in French boats. German boats also usually had turtleback foredecks and much greater funnel rake than those of other countries. Torpedo boats from this period were suited exclusively for coastal service. The smallest boats, such as the Italian Euterpe class, were used for harbor defense only, since their range was only about 400 miles. Several of the Euterpe and similar Mosca classes were stationed on lakes Maggiore, Lugano, and Garda, except for the latter, presumably to defend against a potential attack by Switzerland. The larger boats had a range of about 2,000 miles at 10 knots, but still were not suitable for long-distance autonomous operation. Furthermore, although contemporary articles often praise the seakeeping qualities of torpedo boats of the 1880s, the reality revealed in logbooks and diaries is that this praise is more for their ability to survive relatively heavy weather than to operate effectively in such conditions. Very few boats could much exceed 20 knots, even in ideal conditions, only 3 or 4 knots more than contemporary battleships that could maintain their speeds in rougher weather. The combination of speed, range, and seakeeping, together with the short range of available torpedoes, meant that torpedo boats could be effective only in large numbers in limited circumstances for short-range tactical offense and strategic defense. And now it's over to Ian.
Right, thank you, Paul. Although the Whitehead torpedo had been accepted by the Austro-Hungarian Navy in 1868, it was not until 1875 that one of these weapons was used in anger, and then at the other side of the world in the Eastern Pacific Ocean. One of the Royal Navy's ships trialing torpedoes at that time was HMS Shah, a sail and steam frigate, which was, on the conclusion of the trials, which probably took place somewhere near the Thames and Medway, deployed to the Pacific. Now, at this time, a small ironclad called the Huascar, equipped with a tower turret, having been captured by a rebel faction off the Chilean coast, was operating virtually as a pirate and had attacked merchant vessels, some of which would have been steaming under the British flag. Now, this picture shows her in a later battle with a South American warship. But Shah, having tracked down this vessel, she and her escort, HMS Amethyst, fired a total of 427 non-explosive rounds at her. As these made not the slightest impact on her ironclad hull, the captain of Shah decided to deploy 2 small torpedo rams, which he carried on deck. These were fitted out with Whitehead 14-inch weapons, and although able to get within an acceptable firing range of this target, both attacks missed the target. Now, this is an important point, as the lack of directional stability in the Whitehead torpedo had yet to be solved. Robert Whitehead and his factory was not the only place designing and building torpedoes in the 1870s. As we know, other countries had started to build them under license. And whilst the German government continued to buy from Whitehead, members of a German firm visiting Fiume were believed to have stolen key drawings from Whitehead's office whilst they were there. Oddly enough, this firm was called Schwarzkopf, which, when translated into English, comes out as blackhead. So we have a blackhead stealing from a whitehead. Now, this firm, based in Berlin, then sold their torpedoes on the world market. The British continued to build and improve them under license, sharing the development of them with Whitehead. Now, as I have said earlier, the USA followed a slightly different path using indigenous inventors. In 1886, a review of the models on offer was undertaken, and the background to the report showed how the USA naval staffs were viewing the torpedo very much as a weapon for the defense of the coast and its harbors, and not so much as an offensive weapon for use on the high seas. And as a preface to this report, the authors acknowledged that the USA was dropping behind in the acquisition of this weapon and in the vessels to launch it. Under consideration at this time were 3 torpedo models which were trialed and examined extensively. The Sims, the American Torpedo Company model, the Howl, and sorry, it should be in 4th, and the Weeks rocket torpedo. Now, the Sims Edison model consisted of float under which was suspended the torpedo, which was 28 feet long, contained a warhead, and it's an electric engine. And the system was operated from the shore by a mothership using an electrical cable for the supply and control of the device. So the range of the weapon was limited to the length of the cable. Probably just something in excess of a mile could be achieved, but like the Brennan, which I referred to earlier, it was really only good for harbor defense. The Navy Board, the American Navy Board, concluded it was not adaptable for naval use. The Weeks rocket torpedo was regarded as being so large, I think it was nearly 30 foot long, that it was unmanageable on a small vessel, though the report noted that smaller versions of that torpedo might well be useful in close quarters actions inshore. The model produced by the American Torpedo Company had some serious drawbacks, but the main one was the volatile nature of the fuel for its engine, relying as it did on sulfuric acid, which had to be stored in flasks. Refueling at sea would then have been a difficult and dangerous business. Indeed, the company did not allow a trial of this procedure. It also ran on the surface and could thus be repulsed by gunfire. The 4th model examined had one major point in its favor, which prompted the course for further development. And this was the Howl torpedo, which relied for its power on a spinning flywheel inside the torpedo. However, before launch, this flywheel had to be brought up to a high speed using a steam turbine. Again, this meant carrying out a difficult procedure on deck just before launch. And the flywheel drove the propellers, presumably contra-rotating, and gave the device an important quality. Now, its main advantage was that because it had a fast-spinning flywheel, its directional stability far outmatched the Whitehead model. Now, at this point, we should return to Austria and an engineer called Aubry. Now, the gyroscope had been discovered by a Frenchman, Léon Foucault, in 1851, and this brilliant device had been ignored for 50 years. Aubry rediscovered it in 1895 and adapted it for steering of torpedoes. He patented his design and sold it to Whitehead for use in his torpedoes. The device was minute, with a bronze flywheel weighing just 1.5 pounds. It was spun by a jet of air, no problem, as the Whitehead torpedo had in its air chamber plenty of air under considerable pressure. The gyroscope gave the Whitehead the one key ability it had been missing for 29 years, directional stability. With this enhancement, it became a much more attractive proposition than the hull due to the other advantages it had over that model. I cannot overemphasize the importance of directional stability, particularly when the torpedo was to be launched as a broadside attack from a weather deck tube, or even under the water for that matter. When it entered the wash of a dispatching vessel, which would have been traveling at, say, 30 knots, without the gyroscope to steady it in the direction in which it was fired, it would have been deflected considerably by the turbulence of the water at its entry point. Beyond that, a rough sea could also affect it, despite the fact that it was running underwater. Speed, to an extent, but particularly range, still needed to be improved if the weapon was to be of any use in a mobile sea battle. And the way to do this was through an increase in engine power, and apart from shifting from 3 to 4 cylinders, that called for an increase in pressure in the air chamber, and possibly the enlargement of that chamber. So to conclude, let us look at the ever-increasing performance of this weapon from 1890 to 1914. Earlier I mentioned that by 1890, the Whitehead Fiume Mark II torpedo had achieved a speed of 30 knots, but the range was still only 800 yards. It took another 15 years for that range to be increased to 2,100 yards, a date which coincides with the Battle of Tsushima, where in the closing stages, the Japanese made full use of their torpedo boat flotillas, and was the first time when these little vessels really showed up as being highly effective. The device still contained its radial 3-cylinder compressed air Brotherhood engine and the same 18-inch diameter to its body. So my guess is that somehow the air chamber must have either been enlarged or made capable of withstanding greater pressure. At the same time, the weight of the torpedo had increased from 1,136 pounds to 1,609 pounds, and the warhead from 198 pounds to 220 pounds. Some of this extra weight may well have been allocated to strengthening the air chamber. In 1907, the compressed air was delivered to the engine having been heated, and this gave the weapon a speed of 34 knots, and more importantly, a range of 4,370 yards. Now we are getting to a stage where it is beginning to have the capability of being used in a fast-running sea battle. As I mentioned earlier, the British had had a lot to do with the improvement of the weapon, and one such improvement was, in 1907, an increase in the girth of the torpedo to 21 inches. In the following year, the weapon was given a thermal engine, which gave the Fiume 18-inch model a speed of 42 knots, rising to 44 knots in 1913, with both marks of the Fiume one having a range of 6,560 yards, whereas the British 21-inch version retained its speed of 29 to 30 knots, but attained a range of 10,000 yards. Although not deployed on British displacement torpedo boats, which had largely disappeared by the beginning of World War I, the Royal Gun Factory at Portland had produced in 1917 a faster torpedo, shown here, capable of 40 knots, using a Brotherhood 4-cylinder radial engine fueled by heated compressed air. It had a range of 13,500 yards and a much heavier warhead. This weapon was now ready for major fleet action on the decks of destroyers. But we have a bit to get through before we reach that point. Now, the important consideration in all this development is to work out how the performance, size, weight, and power of the weapon dictated the sort of vessel, in terms of size, speed, and maneuverability, that should carry and launch it, and then the tactical use to which it should be put. And Paul will now take you into the realm of the former consideration and perhaps the latter as well. Over to you, Paul.
A noticeable change in torpedo boat development took place in the late 1880s. The Russian war scare of 1885 in particular led the Admiralty to more fully appreciate the fact that both France and Russia had built up much more numerous torpedo boat forces than that of the Royal Navy, and that it needed to develop a counter to them. Simultaneously, the French Navy began developing larger torpedo boats with longer range and better seakeeping qualities that could undertake more distant operations, either autonomously or as part of a fleet. The result was the emergence of more capable torpedo boat designs. The French designated their new torpedo boats Torpedo de haute mer. Their first series, the Balny class of 1886, designed by Normand, soon proved to be too slow and too small. Their successors, the Ouragan class from Chantier de la Loire, were better sailboats, but still too slow, despite incorporating innovative quadruple expansion engines. The Coureur class was a Thornycroft design. And in fact, if you look at this, you'd think it was a Thornycroft design. It's very, very distinctly of that type. This class could exceed 23 knots, but they proved to be too lightly built for longevity. However, Normand's second contribution to the type, the Avant-Garde class, was a success and became the basis for subsequent development of this type of torpedo boat in French service. On trials, the Normand boat exceeded 25 knots, despite being designed for only 21 knots. All of these boats were about 120 tons, more than double the tonnage of French coastal torpedo boats. France continued to construct Torpedo de haute mer up to the 1898 program, relying heavily on the evolving Normand design. The boats grew very little in size, but machinery improvements increased performance, culminating in Fauban, launched in 1895, which reached 31 knots on trials, becoming the first ship in the world to exceed 30 knots. Normand also built the innovative and probably unique Mistral class, the final boats of this type, which incorporated a 24mm armored box with a 9mm deck to protect the machinery. Despite the necessary increase in weight, this class still made over 28 knots on trials. It's interesting to note how much difference the skill of the yard made to the performance of boats. Boats built by Chantier de la Loire to the exact same design only managed to make barely 26 knots. The initial British response to the sheer numbers of French and Russian torpedo boats was a group known as the 125-footers. They were actually closer to 130 feet long. Thornycroft built the majority of these, and they were the last British boats delivered with the bulbous bow, which was rapidly replaced with a straight stem to improve seakeeping. The 125-footers were an interesting design, since they were designed with one fixed bow torpedo tube and an interchangeable armament of either two twin deck tubes or two 3-pounders and two Nordenfeldt machine guns. When fitted with the gun armament, they were designated torpedo catchers and intended as fleet escorts. Their suitability for this role is questionable, since they could only make 18 to 20 knots in ideal conditions, except for the last of the type, Yarrow's TB-79 here illustrated, which had a 1,000 horsepower triple expansion engine instead of the 700 horsepower engines of the others, and could make 22 knots. Yarrow's next boat, TB-80, was the first British torpedo boat with a turtleback forecastle, although in this case, photograph was taken prior to it being fitted with that. So it still has the bullnose bow, and you can see how wet it is. It was followed by 8 slightly larger versions of TB-79, 85 tons instead of 75 tons, that needed 1,300 horsepower to achieve nearly 23 knots. There was also another very interesting large British torpedo boat of this era. TB-81 was built by J. Samuel White as a private venture and was designated by the company a torpedo boat destroyer. It was snapped up by the Admiralty in 1885. This 137-ton vessel carried a single fixed bow tube, 2 single deck tubes, and 4 3-pounders, and made 23 knots on 1,330 horsepower. The final group of British torpedo boats built during this period were essentially developments of these earlier boats. The 140-footers were very similar to the 125-footers, but mounted the new 18-inch torpedoes, which Ian has just been describing, which had a greatly improved range and heavier warhead. The added displacement required increased horsepower to 2,000 horsepower or more to maintain a speed of 23 knots. The 160-footers that followed were much bigger. Displacement rose from about 140 tons to around 200 tons, forcing yet another increase in power to 3,000 horsepower, although this did bring about maximum speeds close to 25 knots. The much increased displacement made these boats considerably more seaworthy than the earlier boats, but the advent and success of the new torpedo boat destroyers, which we're going to be talking about sometime in the future, rendered them largely obsolescent. German torpedo boat development was much more linear. The basic Schichau design went into production in 1884. For the next 15 years, the firm had a virtual monopoly over torpedo boat construction for the Imperial German Navy. Schichau built 89 out of 95 boats delivered to the fleet in this period. Tonnage rose from 97 to 167 tons, speed from just under 20 knots to just over 25 knots, and power from 870 horsepower to 2,140. The first boats had two 350 millimeter fixed bow torpedo tubes. The last had three 450 millimeter tubes, one bow and two on deck. The gun armament remained negligible. Two 37 millimeter Nordenfeldt guns originally, and a single 50 millimeter quick fire on the final boats, which you can see abaft the mast in this photograph. There was a small series of 9 division boats built by Schichau between 1886 and 1894. These were enlarged versions of the torpedo boats, ranging from 295 to 450 tons, and with essentially the same performance as armament as the regular boats that were their contemporaries. These division boats were designed to act as leaders for torpedo boat flotillas, the extra space accommodating necessary command staff, but it did not enhance the flotilla's fighting power. With the exception of the United States, which had a negligible torpedo boat force, most other navies relied on purchasing or license building French, German, or British designs. The one exception was Italy, which developed a few quasi-independent designs based on Schichau concepts, and then constructed appreciable numbers of torpedo boats, very similar to contemporary Thornycroft types. This was hardly surprising, since the lead yard, Patterson in Naples, was essentially a Thornycroft subsidiary. Several navies experimented with an alternative approach to constructing torpedo boats with sufficient range and seakeeping to accompany the main fleet, bringing torpedo boats with them and launch them when needed. The earliest effort in this direction seems to have been by Italy. The ironclad Caio Duilio, which entered service in 1880, was equipped with a small torpedo boat launched through its stern at sea. The model shows the launching of it. 2 battleships, Jingyuan and Zhenyuan, built by A.G. Vulcan for the Imperial Chinese Navy, also were equipped with small torpedo boats and suitable launching gear. You can see them in the photograph just abaft the funnels. They were commissioned into the Beiyang fleet in 1885 and scuttled at Wei in 1895. Britain and France each built a dedicated cruiser-type vessel to transport and launch torpedo boats to support their fleets. HMS Vulcan, commissioned in 1890, and served in the Mediterranean fleet into the early 1900s. I think it was decommissioned in 1907, but apparently found more use as a depot ship than in its design role. Foudre in France, commissioned in 1896, and also served in the Mediterranean. It was converted to become a repair ship in 1907. It later gained some fame as the world's first seaplane carrier from 1910. Overall, these experiments did not prove very successful in solving the problems of adding torpedo boats to the fleet, although it is interesting that the concept of using cruisers to carry torpedo boats was incorporated into the specifications for the first coastal motor torpedo boats in World War I. Despite the gains in performance and increased size, torpedo boats in the period up to 1905 did not really break through to become game changers. The Japanese surprise attack on Port Arthur on the night of 8th of February 1904 was conducted using destroyers, the torpedo boat's successors. It actually was not particularly successful. They hit 2 battleships. They sank in very shallow water and were refloated very quickly and put back into service within months. At Tsushima, the torpedo boats made up just over 40% of the Japanese fleet's light forces and succeeded in sinking the battleship Navarin. Ironically, although their torpedoes severely damaged the battleship, it was floating mines launched from the torpedo boats which actually sank it. I only took this basically up to 1905, and largely that's because a lot of what happens after this with torpedo boats is really undermined by torpedo boat destroyer development, which is probably better to deal with it in that context.
Absolutely. And we're going on to discuss torpedo boat destroyers and indeed torpedo gunboats in the next session in about 4 months' time.